I always thought our marriage was unbreakable. 20 years together, so many shared memories, victories, and defeats endured together. We were always a strong couple, and our union had passed through tests that could have broken anyone. But the last few years had become hard. It was as if we were on opposite sides of a wall, growing between us slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it became solid and impassable. And now, instead of laughter at dinner, there were only polite questions about how the day went. Instead of evening conversations, there was awkward silence. I tried to convince myself it was temporary. Sarah worked even more, and I increasingly stayed late at the office, spending long hours on reports and projects I had put off for tomorrow. Time seemed to slip through our fingers, leaving only emptiness. Our marriage, which I once thought of as a fortress, now looked like cracks in a mirror. We tried to ignore them, hoping that if we didn't look too closely, it wouldn't shatter. Sarah was always the one who inspired me to live, who helped me move forward. She ignited a fire in me, gave me strength and faith in a better future. But over the years, everything changed. Our conversations became slippery, like glass. Words lacked a solid base. I tried to bring it up, but each time it ended with a sigh and a barely audible, "Later, Mark. I'm tired." And I knew she was right. We were both tired. Of everything. And so, one evening during dinner, while she was absorbed in reading her daily reports, I finally took a deep breath and said, "Sarah, maybe we could go away for the weekend. We need to escape from all of this. The noise, our habits, like before. Remember when we went to the lake?" She looked up in surprise, her gaze lingering on me. At that moment, I realized how long it had been since I'd seen her look directly into my eyes. That gaze, exhausted yet familiar, held a glimpse of my Sarah, something real. After a long pause, she nodded. "All right, Mark. Let's try." We decided to go to the lake where we'd spent our first summer weekends together, back when we'd just started dating. It was a quiet retreat, with crackling fires and fresh air that seemed to wash away all worries. I hoped that by returning here we could finally shed the weight of daily life and find each other again. On Friday evening, we packed our things in the car, talking lightly about the road and the distance. Finally, late that night, we reached the place. I unpacked, started a fire, and Sarah settled by the water, gazing into the distance. There was something captivating about her posture, weary but full of expectation, as if she awaited something from this trip, just like I did. For a long time, we were silent. I added wood to the fire, the flames dancing and casting shadows over our faces. In that fire, I saw us, two people with a chance to fix things, a chance to return to ourselves. "Do you miss those days, Sarah?" I asked finally, uncertain of what I truly hoped to hear. She remained silent. Only after some time did she finally pull her gaze from the water and quietly say, "Sometimes it feels like we've forgotten what it means to be together." Her words cut to the heart of what I had been avoiding. We had forgotten what it felt like to truly see each other. We'd become strangers in the home we had built, strangers among the memories that once united us. That night, as the fire faded, I realized that this might be our last chance. We needed more than just a break. We needed to find a way to understand each other anew, to rediscover the words that once came so easily, and to find something that would make us feel alive again. We woke up early. The sunlight slowly broke through the tree branches, illuminating our small retreat by the lake with a warm, tranquil light. Sarah was already up, sitting at the edge of the pier, dipping her fingers in the water, watching the ripples she made. I froze, watching her. Such a simple scene. Yet it reminded me how long it had been since I'd seen her so calm. When I approached, she didn't take her gaze from the water but seemed to sense my presence. "Join me?" she asked softly, tilting her head slightly. I sat beside her, letting my legs dangle in the cool water. For a while we were silent, savoring the sounds of nature. This quiet morning, free from the pressures of everyday life, was something we both needed. Here, away from our routines, conversation came more easily. And looking at her reflection in the water, I found the courage to suggest something we hadn't done in years. "What about a bar?" I proposed, surprising even myself. She turned to me, raising her eyebrows. "A bar?" she echoed, a smile mixing surprise with a faint excitement. Yes, I smiled back. Like the old days. Just forget everything, dance, have fun. She nodded as if considering the idea, then chuckled. Why not? That evening, we went to a small lakeside bar, the only one around. There was something about the place. Dim lights, loud music, and flickering string lights that created an atmosphere far removed from our usual lives. Here no one knew us, and there were no glances weighing on our shoulders. We sat at a table by the window, and I ordered us drinks. Sarah looked beautiful. Her face glowed, and it seemed as if the weight of the last few years was lifting. When one of her favorite songs came on, she smiled at me, then stood and extended her hand. "Shall we dance?" I sighed, but decided not to refuse. We stepped onto the small dance floor. Sarah moved freely, as if dancing brought her a joy she'd forgotten. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the music. I watched her and remembered all the times she'd danced just for us, with fire in her eyes, confident that I was watching only her. After a few songs, I felt my energy waning. I nodded to her, signaling that I wanted to rest and return to our table. She remained on the dance floor, seeming to dissolve into the music and light, and at that moment I realized that this freedom made her happy. Watching her dance, I unexpectedly felt an inner calm. This scene, in which she simply enjoyed herself, was something new for both of us. I had never let her be so independent, but now it felt right. After some time, she returned to me, her face flushed with dance and joy. "So, how's the bar?" I laughed, asking. "Does it feel like old times?" "Even better," she replied, sitting beside me and leaning close. Our eyes met, and I saw in her eyes the Sarah I used to know, alive, passionate, and sincere. Sarah leaned towards me, and we kissed. This kiss was simple but special. It reminded me of all our moments together, of everything we'd lived through. It was as if, in a single moment, this kiss restored everything I had thought lost. When she pulled back, a soft smile played on her lips. "Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be free," she whispered. "I should be thanking you for giving us another chance," I replied, feeling her words penetrate deeply. That night we returned to our retreat, and the forest's silence felt different. We drove back, holding hands tightly, as if afraid to lose each other again. For the first time in a long time, I was certain that we would find a way, that this small step, allowing Sarah to be herself, could become the beginning of a new path together. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the dense branches, promising another warm day. Sarah and I sat on the small balcony of the cabin, enjoying the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the quiet. There was a lightness in the air, something we had both been striving for, but also something more, a sense that we were on the verge of something new. I could feel it in my skin. "You know," Sarah began unexpectedly, stirring sugar into her coffee slowly, "I feel like I've tried so many times to tell you what I truly need, but every time, I was afraid it might ruin everything." I paused, reflecting. It was hard to admit that I had often shut myself off from her words. I hadn't truly heard her, as if my own fears were louder than her voice. But now, looking at her, I felt I could handle whatever she needed to say, no matter how painful it might be. "I know, Sarah," I replied softly, "and I haven't been completely honest with you either. We made ourselves unhappy, locking up our desires and fears." She looked up at me, something warm, almost sad but hopeful glinting in her eyes. "Remember," she said, "when we first started dating, you always said we should be more than just spouses to each other. We should be friends. Since then, I often tried talking to you like a friend, but I was afraid it might push you away." I nodded, realizing how long ago we'd lost that friendship aspect of our closeness. It had been something so simple and natural in the beginning, but it had faded under the weight of years and obligations. "I want to get that back," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. "Let's talk honestly about what each of us truly wants, without fear or restraint." Sarah smiled, seeming to breathe a sigh of relief. "All right, Mark," she said quietly. "I always loved dancing, and I could never fully surrender to it, knowing it might make you uncomfortable. I wanted to feel free, but I was afraid it would seem strange or inappropriate to you." I was stunned by her words, so simple yet so powerful. Sarah just wanted to feel free without guilt, and unknowingly I had limited her. How long had this been going on? I didn't know, I said softly. I'm sorry. I really didn't know how important that was to you. She reached for my hand, and I squeezed her fingers tightly in mine. In the quietness surrounded by the sounds of nature, more was said than in years of conversation. I saw that her desire wasn't just to dance, it was her way to find herself, to feel alive. And suddenly, I wanted to do something meaningful for her, to let her know that I finally saw her for who she truly was. Here's the plan, I proposed. You'll dance as much as you want, whether with friends or alone, and I'll always be there to support you. She looked at me in surprise, and a genuine spark appeared in her eyes, the kind I hadn't seen in so long. Mark, really? Yes, really, I answered, pulling her close and kissing her gently. This kiss felt different, tender but full of meaning, like a promise made to each other. When we returned to the cabin, I felt a strength within me, not physical, but an inner confidence that I could be the person she needed once again. Sarah's gaze was peaceful, as if the weight she had carried had dissolved in the quiet of these walls. After breakfast, we decided to go for a walk along the lake shore. We walked, chatting about trivial things, laughing at small jokes. It all felt so genuine and alive, as if we'd left all the built-up negativity behind. Our journey to each other was just beginning, but with every step, I understood that we were ready to see it through to the end. We stopped by the stones along the shore, listening to the sound of the water and savoring the moment. Sarah watched the waves, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was becoming herself again, the woman I fell in love with her dreams, desires, and freedom. And now, all I wanted was for her to always be that way. I took her hand and, looking at her, said, "Sarah, thank you for not leaving, for giving us this chance." She squeezed my hand and simply nodded. The last evening of our trip arrived unnoticed. The air was filled with the soft, slightly spicy scent of pine and lake breeze, mingling with the faint smoke from the fire I had started near the cabin. Sarah sat across from me, wrapped in a blanket, her face lit by the fire's warm glow. This was a moment when silence became our language. We could be together without speaking, understanding each other perfectly. I added a couple of logs to the fire and, setting aside my cup of hot tea, leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. You know, Sarah, strange as it sounds, this trip changed so much for me. It's like all these years we were building something, but we lost ourselves in the process. She nodded, gazing into the fire. It felt like we were just walking parallel paths, each on our own, she said quietly. But now we're together again. Those simple words struck deep. It was strange to think that all these years we had lived in the same house, yet perhaps in different worlds. This trip had brought us back to each other, giving us a second chance to truly see and hear each other. I don't want us to retreat into ourselves anymore, I said, not taking my eyes off her. Let's promise always to tell each other what we truly feel. It might be difficult sometimes, but in the end, it's the only way to keep real closeness. Sarah smiled, a warm spark in her eyes that reminded me of her youthful radiance. She reached out her hand, and without hesitation I held it tightly, feeling her warmth seep into me, as if reviving us both. We sat like that for some time, enjoying the silence and the sense of unity that had eluded us for so long. Then, in a sudden impulse, Sarah pulled me along to the lakeshore, which was completely enveloped in night silence and the reflections of stars. The sky stretched above us like an endless dome, and I felt the world shrink to this moment, to just the two of us. "Look, it's beautiful here," she whispered, wrapping her arms around my shoulders and leaning against me. "Have you ever felt this free?" I shook my head, feeling words caught in my throat. Instead, I just held her tighter, closing my eyes and listening to the gentle waves lapping at our feet. This was a moment that needed no words, and I realized that Sarah and I had found what we were searching for. We stood there for a long time, until night wrapped us in complete darkness. I turned to her, and in her eyes I saw the reflection of all the feelings that had been hidden inside us for years. Without a word, I gently touched her lips in a soft, warm kiss, as light as the breath of the night air. This kiss felt like a promise, quiet and strong, like the night that surrounded us. When we returned to the cabin, I held her hand, feeling the last shadows of past grievances and misunderstandings disappear. It seemed we had opened a new chapter, one without the mistakes of the past, with only the determination to move forward together. We sat by the fire until dawn, talking about what we wanted our future weekends, gatherings, and simple life moments to be like. We talked about the journeys we dreamed of taking and how we would create small celebrations for ourselves to remember the importance of being together. With the first rays of sunlight, I noticed Sarah looking at me, and I felt that, after everything, I was ready to walk beside her until the end. We both knew that there were chores and routines waiting for us at home, but now they didn't feel intimidating. Instead, they felt inspiring. When we finally packed up to return, I was certain that this was just the beginning. We had found the strength to step beyond the ordinary, to give each other freedom and the confidence that, no matter the path, we would walk it together. This trip hadn't just brought us back to each other. It gave us a new chance,